East Indians left India, went to the Caribbean, and now they're in the United States of America. What are their problems and how are they overcoming them? Welcome to Carib Nation. I am Paul Niru, Tennessee. Today we will be discussing East Indians in the United States of America. I have with me today in the studios three very eminent Indo-Caribbeans who are living in the United States. I have Dr. Mahin Gosain, who is the author of 12 books, and he's a professor of sociology and anthropology from New York City. I have Dr. Dan Paul Narain, who is also a teacher in New York City, and he is also co-authoring a book on East Indians in the Americas. And I have with me Mala Rampertap, who is a businesswoman from New York City, but living now in Maryland, and she's also been doing broadcasting and working as a journalist. Welcome to our discussion this evening.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen. We've spoken a bit about the first generation of immigrants. We've spoken about the problems with children. Mala, I'm interested in the problems that are created with the transition or the migration with relation to man-woman relationship. In the Caribbean, there was a particular kind of man-woman relationship with particular kind of problems. And now in the United States, where we've had a tradition here of women's liberation and feminism and all that, can you develop that a bit? Tell us what new problems man-woman relationship is confronting and what old problems are persisting?
Well, first of all, if we look at the man-woman relationship in the Caribbean, it was one of subserviency and dominance, where the man was the dominant figure. He was the breadwinner. He was the one that wore the pants. Now, coming to America, we face a problem because a lot of households are dual income. So you have women who are becoming more educated, who are bringing in an income into the household, and as a result, our wants and desires are changing. We want more respect, we want equality, we want equilibrium across the board in the relationship. And this is obviously quite a bit of a problem because of this dichotomy in the relationship of when you look at the Caribbean and, you know, how men perceive us and how they're perceiving us.
So is there...
I just want to add a footnote to that, Paul, and that is that I do agree with my sister here to some extent, but maybe not totally. And the reason for that is that I don't want the viewer to go away with the impression, you know, being a Caribbean man myself, I don't want the viewer to go away with the impression, you know, that Caribbean men, you know, are terrible to their wives, etc., etc.
Oh,
I think a lot has to do with.
Get to that point.
I think a lot has to do with the families you come from, your social class background,
Exactly.
how you were raised. I mean, I don't think, in my view, I don't think Caribbean men are any different in terms of how women are treated than men from other parts of the world. By that I mean that in some situations women are abused, and in many, many situations women are very happy.
But there are also different cultures, and I think the point she's making right. If you come from a class where women are highly unemployed in the Caribbean, so if they come here and they earn, they must be more independent and they assert themselves.
Paul, can I just say something here? And that is that I have always had, you know, some difficulty with imposing Western standards on culture groups from other parts of the world. You see, a lot of us, we get so caught up in terms of how Western standards should be used that this becomes the measuring rod and this becomes the norm. Societies have existed throughout history, and they're very happy. If a woman wants to stay home and raise her children and cook food, that should be her right to do so.
Yeah, but if you come to the United States, there's a financial pressure that you have to work because you got to pay the mortgage.
But if they can overcome that,
if you could overcome that.
If they can overcome that, and the woman is content staying home, and I know a lot of professional women who tell me, Gosain, I would prefer to stay home
and look after the children.
Look after my kids.
Yeah, I know that as a fact. But Mala, I'm interested, is the divorce rate escalating among Caribbean Indians who are here in the United States, or is it not?
Yes, indeed it is. In fact, I was just talking to an attorney in Richmond Hill, and he was indicating very much so that the divorce rate has gone up tremendously.
But isn't that also because, not only because the women are now working, but because the unfaithful husbands now are now challenged in a different way than they would have been in the Caribbean? In the Caribbean, women might be more willing to accept it, but here women will now go out on their own and have their own liaison. Isn't that a fact?
But that could certainly be a factor. I don't know, though, how unfaithful the Caribbean man is. And let me give you a true example. A colleague of mine...
Unfaithful to the vows, huh?
Yeah,
To the vows of marriage, yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily true. Of course, you know, there are exceptions to that. But this is a very true example, I think, that depicts what's happening in a man-woman relationship. A colleague of mine who's a very educated Guyanese Indian woman she is actually in the process of doing her master's. And she's been married 6-7 years. And her husband is starting to say to her, you know, what is more important? Is it your degree or me? Because you're spending more time in the library, you're becoming more educated. And so her desires, and again, what is important to her is changing. And as a result, unfortunately, what happened is that she decided to forgo her education because she wants to remain married, please her husband, etc. And hence 3 years after, they're now going through a divorce because there's that lack of satisfaction. She's here in the American society and she wants to compete. She wants to further and upgrade herself as a human being. And then there's this problem of the relationship you know, with what we are accustomed to back home and our cultural norms and, you know, mores of what a man-woman relationship is. So there's that problem, you know.
Dan Paul wants to say.
Paul, this back home syndrome is very much prevalent in some of the new communities in the Americas, especially in Richmond Hill, New York City. And one of the things I think the sociologists will pick up in their research is that alcohol plays a very damaging role in the family, in East Indian families. As a result of consumption of alcohol, too much alcohol, there's a great deal of domestic abuse on the part of men towards women.
You found that in Richmond Hill?
That has been happening in Richmond Hill.
Yeah. What about drugs? Drugs is a serious problem in the United States.
Amongst the teenagers,
among
yes.
young people, among people in general. What is the situation with the East Indians from the Caribbean here in the United States? Is it a serious problem?
I have not seen any figures on the drug problem. And I think one reason for that is that, you know, the drug world operates for the most part underground. And as a result, you cannot see it to the extent that you would see other kinds of social problems. But Dan Paul probably knows a little bit more about this. He's been working with the youth in Richmond Hill, and there have been numerous reports of Indian kids from the Caribbean getting involved in drugs and being arrested and sent to jail and so on. Those things have been taking place more
all
and
the
more.
problems in America, then they also have all those problems.
Yes, and
we're not
two problems.
isolated.
You're not isolated.
No,
from
there are
those
two problems.
Your culture hasn't isolated you from the mainstream problem.
According to the 106th and the 102nd precinct in Queens, in which a great number of Guyanese people live, drugs is a big problem. And one of the things which we have not even talked about, AIDS. AIDS is very big.
Yeah, well, tell us about it. Tell us about
Caribbean
it.
community.
Tell us.
Well, AIDS is a very big subject in the Indo-Caribbean community. It's being swept under the carpet because of our culture of being very conservative people. But if you talk to the Indo-Caribbean doctors on Liberty Avenue who treat Guyanese people in particular, they will give you some very astounding figures. And one of the things I think which is not being done in this community is educating people of the dangers of this HIV virus.
Right. AIDS is a very serious problem in the Caribbean
Another problem
itself.
that has been plaguing the community recently, and this has began to surface, and it's more and more of a problem, is teenage pregnancy. I have been talking to a lot of the school counselors in and around the Richmond Hill area, where a large concentration are Indians, and they have been talking about a rising teenage pregnancy problem in the community.
And
You see,
yet a
the Indian
third
community has
problem-
always been looked at as, as quiet, and they go about their business and so on and so forth. But when you talk about some of the people who police the community and some of the people who interact with some of these institutions, I think that you begin to get a slightly different picture.
What's going on?
Now, Paul, we have spent a lot of time talking about all these problems. Now, I think the question should be asked, what can we do as a
Well,
community?
you tell us, what in Richmond Hill can you,
Right, what can
you
we
think
do?
could be done?
Not only in
First,
Richmond,
it starts with the parents.
but in North America.
Male has an idea. Well, how do you think
Well,
we could do it?
I think, first of all, parents need to learn how to communicate with their children.
In the context of the United States?
In the context of being in America, in the context of the academic environment and understanding the culture that our children are exposed to, and we can't keep imposing on them
giving them degrees.
And just telling them, well, this is the way we did it and this is the way it has to be. And that's a big problem. So I think if we can start to correct the parent-child relationship and there's more communication, a lot of, and in fact, in my profession, owning a model agency in New York, I get a lot of girls and guys that come in because the modeling profession is very attractive to anyone. And what I see is a common denominator with our kids is while they may be academically doing very well, socially, in terms of persona, in terms of language, in terms of style and dress and social etiquette, if you will, they are not on a competitive level for American standards. And again, that goes back to the family environment and how they're brought up and how they're being communicated to.
What about intermarriages? In the Caribbean, East Indians have been a bit resistant to marrying outside of the race. Is that the same thing here in the United States?
No. Colin Clark did some work on that, and he found about 97% of the marriages are still racially endogamous, meaning that they marry within the group, as opposed to exogamous. The group in the United States with the lowest divorce rate are the Irish Americans, 1.8 per every 100, and then followed by Italians, 2 per every 100. When the work I did with the Indians, it's about 5 per every 100. Now, you have to look at these marriages in terms of who got married for a green card and who got married for romantic love. And I think therein lies a fundamental difference, because in the statistics, it's all going to show up as they got married. You follow? So the rate of intermarriage with the Indian community is definitely rising. When you look at many Indians, for example, many Indians are intermarried with Hispanics, for example. That seems to be increasing significantly. You're also beginning to see a lot of black Indian marriages and a lot of white Indian marriages. So I don't have figures for the rate of intermarriage per se, but I would definitely say that the rate of intermarriage is definitely
Speaking
increasing.
about marriages, you know, one of the interesting things is that in Guyana and Trinidad and these countries in the Caribbean, if you have a visa or you have citizenship in the United States, it's a big thing. And therefore, going back to get a bride in the Caribbean makes you a big trump card. And a lot of marriages are being arranged based on finance and also based on the fact that the male or the female possess a passport. Have you all had experience of these kind of marriages? Have they been working or not been working?
Well, what you say is true, but that is not unique to the Caribbean.
Historically,
but we are speaking about the
Indian
Caribbean.
subcontinent.
Yeah, but we are
as well.
speaking.
but 9 out of 10 marriages
That is
were
true, but we are
arranged.
speaking about the Caribbean. So I'd like your opinion on the Caribbean. How has that been contributing towards man-woman relationships, marriages, the family system? Have they been working? In the old days, they had arranged marriages and a lot of them worked. But how has it been working? Or after somebody is married, after a month, 2 months, do they get divorced or they stay in the marriage?
I don't think we really have an answer to that. It's a very individual situation. And even though marriages may be arranged to a great extent, love can certainly follow after. So, but in terms of statistics, I think it's a very personalized thing. It's
I
hard to
do
say.
think still that more people, I would say more than half of the Indians, they get married on the basis of their own individual attractions for one another and to one another. But there are situations still where marriages are arranged. The other thing about arranged marriages is that it may not come across as an arranged marriage, but when you look at the network that they find themselves in, that somebody has a son who knows somebody who has a daughter, it's not necessarily arranged, but it's still the network they are working, so to speak.
In America, it's known as a blind date.
So it's an old practice in a new context. Well, listen, we're going to get back to that and we're going to deal with some other issues I'd like to deal with the question of how East Indians in the Caribbean here in the United States relate to East Indians directly from India. But we are going to take a break now, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Please do not leave your TV sets. Welcome back to Carib Nation. We are discussing East Indians in the United States of America, but East Indians from the Caribbean in the United States of America. Dr. Gosain, just before we took the break, I raised the point about East Indians from India. Now here we have a situation where East Indians first came from India to the Caribbean, and in a second wave of immigration to the United States. Now for the first time, you're meeting East Indians from India in large numbers, in the sense that new East Indians that just came from India. How have the East Indians who have just migrated from India to the United States been relating to East Indians that have come to the Caribbean?
The question is a good one. For the outside observer, the Indian community is homogeneous, but every Indian will tell you it is not. And when you look at the relations that exist between the Indians from the Caribbean and the Indians from India who live in the United States, there is a dividing line. The Indian national sees us from the Caribbean as people who are Western, as people who assimilate and who have assimilated Western values, and therefore we are not regarded as an integral part of India. I don't know if you have read Vidya Naipal's introduction, India, a Wounded Civilization.
Yes, I read it.
Where he talked about the fact that he said, India is my home, but yet India cannot be my home. Because as a person being born and raised in Trinidad, studying in England and so on, now living there, going to India for the first time, he didn't feel as though he was a part of India. When you look at the Indian nationals' relations with the Caribbean East Indian living in New York or the United States in the whole, they don't form groups that would include both sets of people. They're very factionalized in terms of how they do things. And there's a tremendous amount of animosity, I would say. Though, you know, if you ask the Indian national, one of the first things they would say to you is that, you know, we reach out to all of our brothers and sisters and so on and so forth. When Indians were massacred in Guyana during the Burnham dictatorship, Indira Gandhi did nothing. Silent, yeah. Indira Gandhi did absolutely nothing. When Indians were literally thrown out of Uganda by the petty thug Idi Amin, India did absolutely nothing. When Fiji witnessed its coup, India did nothing.
Abuse.
So India has this good line of saying we care about our people, but when they find themselves amidst some kind of conflict and difficult situation, India doesn't come forth. One thing I must say that I admire with Israel, and that is that Israel always reaches out to its people. And therein lies the fundamental difference between Israel and India.
So, Dan Paul, would you say that this kind of reality forces the Indo-Caribbean in the United States to strengthen their ties with their homeland being the Caribbean, Guyana, Trinidad, and so forth?
Well, it should.
Because they come to realize
Yes.
that the myth they had when they were in the Caribbean about
Yes.
India being the motherland, perhaps, it's no longer true when you meet an Indian.
It's no longer true. When Indian cricket teams visit the West Indies to play cricket, they have a large amount of support, lots of support, especially in Guyana.
Yeah.
Because of,
and Trinidad.
And Trinidad because of the Indian population.
Yeah.
When you leave and you come here to interact and mix with the indigenous people from India here, the relationship at best is very ambivalent.
Yeah.
Because our customs perhaps are same, but they view us as being different people. We don't speak the language, we don't interact. And even among the Indian community itself, there is a great deal of division. I mean, among the Keralis, the Gujaratis, the Bengalis.
They have their own worldviews.
Enclaves, their own divisions. So that we, to fit into that model, find it extremely difficult.
Mala, but have you also not discovered, I have discovered interacting with Indians from India, that they are more a more conservative kind of people. We are more they are more introvert. We are more extrovert from the Caribbean. We speak loudly. We are more flamboyant and all that. That is the kind of difference I found. I found like there's a difference there.
And I'm happy about that difference. I haven't gone to India on several occasions. You're right that there are a lot of differences in terms of personality displays, but I think also that when you look in terms of the relationship here of Indians from the Caribbean and Indians from India, in their perception and the Indians from India perception, I don't think they will ever accept us as total Indians, quote unquote. And you know, we have also a culture of our own, being
a Caribbean culture, which is
that we embrace.
A transculturation with the African culture, the Amerindian culture, and so forth. Dan Paul, what I would like to know is this: when you are here in the United States, how do you feel in terms of your consciousness? Do you define yourself as a Guyanese, as an Indo-Caribbean, as an Indian? How do you define yourself?
Well, as an Indo-Caribbean, a Guyanese of Indo-Caribbean extraction.
That's how you define it.
American.
A Guyanese, so Guyanese means your nationality,
right.
And Indo-Caribbean means you belong to a broader sphere in the Caribbean. So you have a kind of a two-dimensional personality identity.
And we are,
Guyanese and Caribbean.
And we are very fortunate as a people to do that.
To have that.
To have that.
Because it makes you more complex, it makes you broader in your perspective. Dr. Goswami,
I feel the
it's
same
very
way.
interesting that
I feel the same way
concept.
because almost every semester when I walk into class, you know, I'll ask the students to tell me a little bit about themselves, and then naturally they would ask me, and I would sort of play the guessing game. Well, where am I from? And almost every student will say, well, you're from India.
India.
Because
exactly.
I look Indian,
yeah.
And maybe I have a funny Indian accent too, so they think that I'm from India. And then I would say, no, I am not from India. And actually, in the past, I would get a little bit mad when they would say, I'm from India. So I would tell them, I grew up in a country where steel band, calypso, carnival, you know, and lots of rum and coke and beautiful beaches. I feel very positively identified with Trinidad. I identify very, very strongly with it. So while I don't want to lose my Indian roots, I mean, I want to be who I am. I am Indian, and the world is going to see me as such. I want to know about India, but if you ask me which country I identify with, definitely Trinidad. There's
okay,
no
this brings me to another question, and that is that when you relate towards other races from the Caribbean in the United States, let's say the African Caribbean, do you find you can relate easier to the African Caribbean than you can relate to the East Indian directly from India?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
We grew up.
So you seem to have more in common
Yes.
in your behavior, your outlook,
Absolutely.
your dance, your culture,
Absolutely.
your loud speaking, your mannerisms, your idiom, more with the African Caribbean than you think. And then bring the next one. How do you relate? How
But
do you
that's, mind you, that is only on a social and to some extent cultural level. If we look at it from a religious aspect, then obviously
There's
we
difference.
identify with the
And in
Indians
addition
more.
to that, very quickly, we share a similar history, as we were talking
Okay.
about. I mean, the Afro-Caribbean, the Indo-Caribbean share a similar history. The problem is this: if a black person from the Caribbean were to come to New York City and has to interact with black people from Africa, they would feel and share an exact same problem that we are going to face with Indian people.
That make me think of something else, and that is New York City. All of you have had experience in New York City. There are a lot of Hispanics and a lot of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, African Americans. How have East Indians from the Caribbean been relating to the African Americans and to the Hispanic Americans? Have you been having difficulties? What about the Caucasian American? How have you been?
Well, perhaps that depends on what generation you're looking at. In terms of the older generation and a working class generation like us, I think we don't really have much of a problem. If you look at the teenagers, and then again coming back to the high schools, I think they do have a problem in terms of cultural identity. Indians, Caribbean Indians, they're not whites, but they're not blacks, and they're
Well,
not
is there a lot of
Spanish, so
interaction with the African American and Hispanic American?
In the school system,
in the
yes.
schools, yes. Yes.
Yes.
Are you all, are East Indians from the Caribbean aware that, for example, until very recently in the 60s, that black people could not eat in a coffee shop and so forth, and that African Americans made a tremendous contribution in this country to win civil rights? When they enjoy these rights that they enjoy now, is there an awareness in the Indo-Caribbean community in the United States that they owe some of this wonderful life to the struggles of the African American people, or that consciousness is not there? That knowledge, that consciousness.
Well, the consciousness is there to a certain segment of the population. I mean, the young people who would have learned about Martin Luther King,
exactly.
Malcolm X, their contribution to American politics and the civil rights movement and the end of segregation and so on in the South. Those people would have had a great impact on this young population. I'm not so sure about the older generation.
Do you believe that Indo-Caribbean people, East Indians from the Caribbean in the U.S., you know, in the United States, retiring is a very important thing. It's as important as the lifetime you work. Do you think they'll retire to the Caribbean, or they will retire in the United States?
They'll retire here and they will die here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they might have all good intentions of returning. Most immigrants come, as I had mentioned, I think it was in the earlier show, they come as sojourners. They come to make some money to go back one day, but they don't ever end up going back. So in all likelihood, they would retire here and they would die here.
And
It's
one
what,
of the reasons, I'm
sorry,
sorry,
go ahead.
one of the reasons that will happen is that typically we tend to reside where our children grow up and live.
That's a very important
point. So we're not
point.
going to leave our children
That's a very
behind.
important point, the grandchildren and the children. And
So even with the older generations, they may romance with the idea of going back home, but realistically, as Mahin said, we're going to die right here.
It's
There is
what I've called the myth of the grand return.
The myth of the grand return.
When they come here, the first thing they say, I'm going to be here for 6 months, a year, catch my hand, get some money,
And go back.
either to
home.
Florida or retire to Guyana or Trinidad. And they keep postponing this year after year after year until eventually there's no more return.
Next year never comes.
I'd like to thank you, Dr. Gosain, for having been a panelist on this discussion. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again. I wish you well in the book that you're working on, East Indians in the Americas. And probably the next occasion we could talk about that. Dr. Dan Paul, thank you for being on the program.
you.
And Mala, thanks again, and we are looking forward to seeing you again on Carib Nation. This is Carib Nation once more saying thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next series.